What are you most excited about that's coming?
I love change. I think change is exciting. What are the types of companies that are going through massive transformation? What are the industries that are either being moved towards obsolescence, or what are the new sectors that are growing up because of a new opportunity in the marketplace? That's where I think the most interesting change happens. I can't tell you how many companies I've seen this. There's someone that has a sort of marketing function, and suddenly they become the communications or PR person. There are some adjacencies with communication, but it's not the same thing. That's why you need to have specialists that understand the crafts of this trade, the best practices, that bring to bear sort of all of the different tools at a company's disposal for making sure that they're able to communicate in the most effective way possible.
Welcome to Being Understood, a podcast where we explore what it means to be understood and talk to the communicators who help organizations do that. Today, I am joined by my co-host, Bess. Hi, Bess.
Hey, Liz. How are you?
I'm good.
Okay. And we're also joined by our colleague, Arick. Thanks for coming on today.
I've been looking forward to it for weeks.
Yeah, we know. You've been begging us to come on. So you have a fascinating career. I mean, we could probably spend days talking about all the different things that you've done along the way, but tell us how you started out in communications.
My first real job out of college, I became an investment banker. I worked at JP Morgan in New York, and then I went down and worked for a Dutch bank in Brazil. And I always found myself somehow, some way or other, working on the communication side of investment banking. And at the time, there was like an acquisition going on, and I found myself sort of as the spokesperson. And it was funny because it took me several years to kind of pick up on these clues that no matter what sort of situation I found myself in, that I was always sort of in either a writing capacity or a public speaking capacity. And I think suddenly it kind of dawned on me years later when I started working for Mike Bloomberg, the mayor of New York City, that's actually what my calling in life was, to do something around storytelling, something around communications.
Well, you just gave a nod to it, but you've lived and worked in a number of countries. You also speak multiple languages. Talk a little bit about that experience and how that impacts who you are and how you are a communicator.
Well, my big joke at home is my former wife, my ex-wife, is Brazilian, and now I'm married to an Angolan. I don't like to say current wife. She says current wife. No, I'm your wife. Yeah. But the big joke is that I still get yelled at in Portuguese, but just with a different accent. I've been Portuguese has been part of my life since I was in my early 20s. I speak Spanish as well, and so obviously Latin America. I lived in Africa, Portuguese-speaking Africa and Angola for many years. And as a result, I sort of I wouldn't say flip personalities when I go to another one of these countries, but I'm able to sort of almost seamlessly blend those experiences. And I think it really actually sort of informs the way I approach people, in this country as well, even if it has nothing to do with Latin America or Africa or anywhere else where I've lived. And I look at the world sort of, I think, as this mosaic of different pieces. And I think it really helps me sort of be a better professional, be more empathetic. I'm a lot more tolerant, I think, of new ideas and new ways of thinking. I don't find too many things terribly weird because I've seen a lot of things. So I think all that kind of works to my advantage at the end of the day.
What differences do you think need to be considered socially, interpersonally, to effectively communicate to audiences so they understand? I mean, you've got multiple languages that you can speak in, but what do you think is important to that, especially having worked in multiple countries as well?
Well, I think at the end of the day, communications, no matter what language or what culture you're dealing with, is always about making sure that you understand who you need to talk to and what they need to understand about you. Like, so often you're sitting in a situation and you hear someone talking about something and you just feel they're missing the mark. It's because either they're talking about something that the audience doesn't want to listen to, or they're talking about it in a way that the audience doesn't understand. And so I think it's really important to sort of have that ability, that GPS, if you will, when you're talking, to really understand what is it you're trying to communicate and how to hone that message so it's best delivered.
Yeah. And you've been a journalist for many, many years. So obviously things have changed over the years as far as what newsrooms look like, the role of journalists. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that's changed over the years?
I sort of fell into journalism kind of rather late in life, actually. And it all started because when I moved back from Africa to Minnesota, where I'm from originally, back in 2016 or 17, there was this guy named Donald Trump that was running for president. You may have heard of him.
Yes.
And these people that I used to know when I used to work for the mayor in New York City had all moved up, in their respective organizations. Some of them had gone to other places. But, for example, the guy who's now the current editor-in-chief and founder of CNN Opinion, he reached out to me. He said, hey, Arick, I don't know if this guy Trump has a chance, but, wouldn't it be funny if he were to become president, and then suddenly we have to deal with all these sort of conflict of interest issues of having a billionaire president? We've never had anything like that. But the closest thing we've had would be someone like, say, Mike Bloomberg, who obviously was a multi-billionaire as mayor. And could you talk a little bit about that? And I said, well, look, I'll say two things. One is, I know that Mike Bloomberg and Donald Trump are New Yorkers and they're both billionaires, but I think that's where the comparison pretty much ends. But I'm happy to dive into this issue nonetheless. And so it was sort of through that I ended up becoming like this sort of specialist about, billionaire presidents or billionaire politicians. And of course, as Trump's career sort of took off and he came into the White House, and there was more and more focus on his background in New York, and I had obviously worked a decade in New York City. Sort of my sort of experiences became much more valued, and that's sort of what propelled my journalism career. So today, I write for Newsweek, for CNN, for The Observer, and I've worked in the past for Worth Magazine, for NBC News, Vice, et cetera, and a few others.
I want to come back to those, but let's go back to New York. So you worked for Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who in many respects is lauded as a very successful mayor. You worked in communications with him. What did you learn from that experience? And what are some of the important takeaways from working for a mayor of one of the biggest cities, certainly in this country, but in the world, well known? What did you learn from that experience?
Well, so the thing is, when we came into office, we had a very, very specific mandate. It was right after 9/11. And so the idea, and part of the reason that he won, or I'd say actually the lion's share of the reason that he won, was because they wanted someone that they felt could steward the city through crisis and get Lower Manhattan back on its feet. And so my charge was, as the person who was kind of in charge of all the media assets, the city of New York is very different than any other city. And in fact, I think a lot of people outside of New York, even New Yorkers, don't really understand this, but it's much more akin to something you'd see somewhere like in Europe or Asia, or even like in Latin America and Africa, where you have a kind of a mega state-owned entity. So we created this sort of behemoth called NYC Media Group, which had cable television stations, broadcast stations, radio stations, internet properties, et cetera. And we completely turned the focus on how do we market the rebirth of New York City in the ashes of 9/11. And so that was sort of the mission. It was very clear. And so basically it was all about how do we tell people that New York is back for business, that, we might have got sucker punched during 9/11, but we're back on our feet and we're ready to go. And we didn't want businesses to leave. We wanted tourists to come back. And so it was all about sort of supporting that mission.
And how did you successfully do that?
Well, just like, anything in life, first of all, you have to be very clear about what your mission is, understand the resources, understand the terrain and the constraints that you have, and then put the very best people you can find to work with you, because, one person doesn't do anything alone. Certainly, one of the hallmarks, I think, of the Bloomberg administration was because he was such a respected private sector guy from, he'd been in New York, the financial markets for so many years. There were a lot of people that came to work for him, leaving places like McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or, top, marketing companies, that some of them actually that were already independently wealthy started to work for $1 a year. They just wanted the experience to be part of that effort in rebuilding New York City. And so it's really important to have a really clear plan, hire the best people possible, and then be willing to fail. And I think failing fast is a real hallmark, I think, of entrepreneurs. And being able to sort of understand what went wrong, adjust quickly, and then get back on your feet and try again. And I think, when I was there, I think I led NYC TV to something like 68 Emmy Awards while we were there. I personally won, I think, 6 times. But a lot of that, what we don't talk about are all the duds, all the failures, all the shows that no one ever watched, and then people will never watch again.
Talk about being a TV producer. So segue from the importance of storytelling. Actually, let's go on that. When you were producing these shows for New York, a lot of it was about storytelling. How did you connect New York into the audiences? When we come back to being understood, how did you help New York be better understood with the audiences you were trying to reach and bring to New York?
Well, going back to what I was saying earlier about showing that the city was back on its feet, it was very clear that what makes New York quintessentially New York it's the culture, it's the parks, it's the restaurants, it's the people, it's the history. And so basically, if you take all those different sort of verticals and maybe 2 or 3 that I omitted, I mean, basically you've got your channels. What are you going to focus on? What type of content are you going to make? And then you have to pair that with, personalities. At the end of the day, you can have a great show about sort of great content and great topics and great debates. But if you don't have a personality sort of anchoring that program or that piece of content, it might be a dud. So it's really about communications. You really need to have a really sort of, not only well-informed, but engaging host that's going to sort of drive that connection with viewers. And the thing is, too, is it can't be, at the same token, it can't be too New York in the sense that, it has to be able to speak to the world, because the whole idea was to show the rest of the world, the rest of the country, that New York was open for business. And so we actually ended up doing a lot of stuff in multi-languages because we knew it was going to play in South Korea. We knew it was going to play in French-speaking Africa. And so we did a lot of multilingual programming as well.
When you segue from that to then writing for other publications, you mentioned some of them that you are writing for, CNN, Newsweek, well-known publications. How do you go from the owned channel, thinking about New York TV, to the legacy of those publications and also bringing your own voice?
So I'm in a really privileged position, I think, when it comes to the writing that I do, because I'm not a reporter per se. Mm-hmm. These terms get kind of thrown around nowadays: reporter, journalist, contributor. But for the most part, I'm not reporting on hard news. I'm sort of commenting, observing, curating in some cases. And so as a result, I've been given a lot of leeway to talk about, not only the topics that I want to talk about, but also to frame them in the way that I think makes the most sense, in the way that interests me, and the way in which I think that maybe other people around the world might want to sort of understand these topics. And so sometimes, I might be interviewing a very sort of public figure. I recently interviewed, for example, the former president of Colombia, Iván Duque. And, I could have been talking to him about just the border or the immigration issue or issues that are core to sort of Colombia's geopolitics. But we actually ended up talking about almost a side issue, which is this confrontation that's happening between Guyana and Venezuela, and it's roiling energy markets around the world. So I take the stories and I take the topics in directions that lend themselves to sort of what's going to be the most engaging type of content.
So before this, we were talking about AI and how AI is changing communications and everything. What do you think is the most interesting thing happening with AI right now?
It's interesting. I just had a conversation with someone who's a very prominent sort of tech prognosticator. It's actually Minnesota-based, a guy named Gene Munster. Works for Deepwater Asset Management. He's the guy who, back when the Apple stock was sort of kind of a dud, he's the guy that said this is going to be the first $1 trillion company in the world. And kind of people thought, he's crazy. And then lo and behold, 8 or 9 years later, he got his vindication. And of course, now it's on path to become a $3 trillion company. But anyway, Gene has since then become sort of like this Svengali, if you will, for understanding the Magnificent Seven, the big tech companies, what's happening across technology markets. And certainly he's been really dived headfirst into AI. And one of the things that, he and I were talking about was how AI is going to be roil sort of employment markets. It's going to force a huge, tremendous change that I don't think many of us can even comprehend at this point. Yeah. But to your point, your question, the thing that I thought that he said was so interesting was those who work in the storytelling or creative arts, people that have creativity, they need to generate empathy, they're generating a community. Those are the types of professions that are going to be more valued because those are the things that machines will probably never effectively do. Machines do creativity to a certain extent, but they need, as in, to quote him, a certain human spark to do that. But creating empathy, he made a really interesting point, which is even if you don't know the name of the author, it might just be byline by organization. Mm-hmm. If you know that another human, another beating heart wrote that article, you connect with it in a way that if it's just generated by AI, it doesn't, if you're just looking for pure information, maybe it doesn't matter. But if you're really looking for storytelling, you want to know that another human was behind that. And he actually gave another example. One of the reasons that robotic pets have never taken off, except you said oddly in Japan, they're a big success. But around the world, robotic pets have never taken off because people understand that pet doesn't have a beating heart. And so one of the reasons that, that makes humans uniquely human is that ability to connect with another biological being with another beating heart. And so I think to that extent, I think the AI revolution is going to be displacing a lot of we talk about how robotization and AI is going to be displacing lots of jobs that we can understand, whether it be deliveries or people that work in warehouses or even like retail salespeople eventually. But we don't think about is what about the white collar workers that work in finance, et cetera. If they're not doing something that's innately creative, their job is probably at risk.
And on that really fun note, but staying with technology. Obviously, AI is really changing and transforming things really quickly. The way we communicate is also really changing and transforming. And something that we talk about a lot is short form video and how to take all of these things we've been talking about of your experiences and putting them toward short form ways of engaging, especially for a younger generation that's mostly getting its information and news via the TikToks, the Reels, the Snapchats of the world. What have you learned about that form of communicating and its importance in, again, being understood by those audiences?
I think there's a huge chasm right now between the way in which the corporate world understands communication and the way in which Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which is coming right on its heels, want to be communicated to. Mm-hmm. That chasm is a huge opportunity for companies or firms like Tunheim that can fill that gap or help bridge that gap. I've always made fun of corporate videos for as long as I can remember seeing corporate videos. But I mean, my making fun of them doesn't mean that I hate them. But if you show it to my 19-year-old daughter, I mean, she will click off that as fast as she can find a button on her phone or on a computer. So, storytelling from a corporate narrative needs to change, and it needs to change dramatically. And video is the language in which you communicate with these young audiences. It's not press releases. It's not, boring corporate video with talking heads and corporate sounding music behind it and graphics that look like they were generated in the 80s or 90s. It has to be something that's really going to connect with them on an emotional level, using sort of spokespeople that connect with them both in terms of their age as well as their demeanor and the types of things, the cultural references they're making. And it's a huge opportunity, I think, for companies, but it's also a huge threat for those that are unable to bridge that gap.
And streaming as well. I mean, that's another area that's changed a lot from even when you were doing TV production. The world has changed in a lot of those ways. How do you see the emergence of these channels being important to information dissemination?
I think in a world of infinite choice, curation becomes paramount. Mm-hmm. And I think that those who are able to effectively curate all that information are those that are going to rise to the top. And so being in the curation business is in itself a creative endeavor. But I think it's important that there's those that are doing sort of that meta-analysis, that are sort of providing that commentary on the contours of all this information that we're confronted with. Those are the types of activities and professions that are going to rise to the top. And I think the companies that are in the business where there's lots of information, and let's just take, for example, financial, how many wealth managers do you know? I personally probably know 50. I've heard of another 100, and every day I see another 1,000. Mm-hmm. Why am I going to choose one over another? Well, mm-hmm. who's in the business of curating that? And that's why lists are so popular. People love lists, even when, listicles, mm-hmm. the top 10 this, the top 5 this, the top 20 this. People that are really good at curating, or organizations that are good at curating information, are really going to be valuable more and more as information becomes more and more commoditized.
Yeah, I mean, so connecting some of these dots. So AI is going to help curation, hopefully. Hopefully the tools get better because they're curating better. I know, depending on what I've watched in the last week on TikTok, I noticed my videos change, and sometimes for the better. And sometimes I'm like, no, go back to the other stuff that I liked before. And I think that's happening on Facebook. It's happening on any channel.
Can I tell you what's happening on my TikTok?
Please.
I've been banned twice.
Oh, no.
And I'll tell you why. They say, you appear to be under 13 years old. And it's because my daughter gets a hold of it, and she's constantly posting her own little videos of making, and she's 7. And so it's really interesting that TikTok, their AI, their algorithms have picked up that, most likely the person using this account is not 13 years old. And so I've been banned twice. In fact, I can't even get on it now, so I got to use my wife's TikTok. Well, that's the story.
But I think, and actually that's good in some ways. I'm glad to hear that they are utilizing their technology to help ensure that they're staying within the guise of the law. I think that's part of the challenge is both how do these tools curate the experience and so I guess, how do you see this going? The tools that curate better are going to be more successful, I think. But how do we keep also not getting so pigeonholed into, well, I only want to see, for me, dog videos and these kinds of things, that I'm not getting fed the news I need to know, the commentary that I need to understand to feed my mind. We've become so distanced in how, or I guess in some ways so curated and in some ways not curated enough to be really fully informed. And this is something that keeps me up at night, is how we communicate and how people are getting their information. How do you see that either getting better or worse, or where is it going?
I think there's definitely a link between machine learning / AI, hyper-personalization, and tribalism. Mm-hmm. I think that it's only natural, and it's only going to get worse, that as these machines better understand our proclivities, they are going to serve us more and more content that feeds into those things. Because to the earlier point, they're feeding us stuff that we want to know. That's the idea of communicating in some respects. And so kind of what I think what you're suggesting is how do we keep a semblance of a society with common core values if everything is so hyper-personalized and so hyper-catered to what we happen to be interested in. And in fact, and then you add on top of that, the ability for deep fakes that is already, we've seen it in this election with that fake Biden call in New Hampshire. Deep fake video is almost there. It's there, but it's almost there. I don't know if you guys heard about the story in Hong Kong, where there was one guy, a real guy, on a phone call, a Zoom call with like 6 people that he knows in real life. And it was 6 colleagues, and they convinced him to make a $25 million wire transfer to some account because he thought it was his boss's. They were all on a Zoom call. They said, hey, yes, let's go, 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 go. He did it. Turns out all those 6 people were avatars. They were all fakes.
I did not see this, but that is terrifying.
Yeah. And these are people that it wasn't like, oh, I've heard of this person. No, it's like he's had like, a beer or coffee or whatever with these people. So that just shows you where this technology is going. And I think that this, and people are going to understand that, and this sort of inert or, mistrust of other human beings, of the news that you're getting, coupled with hyper-personalization, hyper-curation, is just going to lead to more polarization and tribalization. And if your next question is, well, what's the answer to that? I don't know.
Yeah. I was going to actually ask what other threats you think are out there as far as technology goes.
Well, I think ultimately there's, I like to focus more on the positives of what AI is going to give us. I think that there is going to be, for example, through science, there are going to be diseases that have eluded the best scientists and infectionologists and other immunologists for years that are going to be solved, suddenly because AI is able to run so many different scenarios, simultaneously. Now, the one thing that I think that's going to keep AI perhaps in check for a while are the power requirements. The power requirements for AI are enormous. And right now, the U.S. energy grid, for example, the power supply plus the grid is just not able to supply that.
Yeah.
So I think what might happen is that over the next couple of years, we may see some metering back, and AI's full potential might not be realized in the way that some people are prognosticating, just because of the power requirements. And that leads to, I think, a really another interesting area that's maybe worth talking about a little bit, which is the U.S. has a huge power challenge ahead of itself. And not only just power in terms of pure power for, AI and these data centers that are going to be housing these massive servers, but also how to do that in a way that's, environmentally conscious, in a way that's not going to be spurring or accelerating climate change. So I think the move to clean energy and how to do that in a way at scale that's going to be able to power this AI revolution that's coming, I think those are really interesting areas. And I think that there's a lot of interesting companies that are experimenting in that. I think the government has a big role to play. But I think moreover, there's also a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs that are looking to be disruptive in the power space.
Are you optimistic about the horizon? Given all these things and given all the people you're talking to, we have some of the smartest people with the best technology attacking things that have, as you said, eluded us previously. And yet there are a lot of reasons to be for people to feel a little fearful.
Uneasy.
Yeah, but how optimistic are you? And do you have trust in our government and other governments' ability to maximize this moment?
Change is always hard. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the big tech companies, you look at the people that run Meta and Alphabet, and even Elon Musk, will tell you that they believe that AI is the singular biggest tech transformation in the history of recent tech. That means from the days of Cray computers and the Honeywells and then the IBMs and the supercomputers and the move to personal computers and then the dawn of the internet and then Facebook and eBay and TikTok and all that stuff and mobile telephony and all that, AI is by far the biggest change. And so that itself is crazy because the technology era has been in itself the biggest change in the history of humanity.
Right.
So we're looking at the biggest change ever.
Yeah.
Period. So is that exciting? On one hand, yes. Is it going to present a whole panoply of challenges and issues that humanity has never had to sort of circumvent or navigate before? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think that in part the leaders that are going to be successful in the future of organizations or even entrepreneurs or even nonprofits are going to have to be extremely agile. They're going to be flexible, and I think that's part of what comes back to my background, to kind of coming full circle, is having a very global perspective, having sort of lived in different cultures, understanding how different people think, being able to respond quickly to situations you've never encountered before. That almost becomes like muscle memory. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a skill set that's going to have to be more widely dispersed among Americans if they're going to be successful in the dawn of across the world, in fact, the dawn of this new era.
And talk a little bit about what does it take to do that? Because I think in many ways, it takes a curiosity about the world. You are a very curious person about the world and seeking experiences. I like to talk about it as collecting experiences. You are a collector of many experiences. What do you think, if you're giving advice to Americans for what that takes, what do you lean into in order to do that?
2 words: be uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It's really important to be uncomfortable. I was in my car last night and I heard an ad. I was listening, I think, to Sirius XM, one of the major simulcasts, I won't say which one, of one of the major cable news stations. And anyway, this ad was, and I won't say the name of the company, but it was basically, I'm paraphrasing the pitch, but it was like, hey, you're an American, and I know that you don't like your legs runny when you go overseas. You like to have really nice, large bathrooms. You don't want to have to do it. It was like basically saying, we can take you to Costa Rica or the Taj Mahal or on a safari in Africa, but you can still be an American and have all the amenities that you like, and you won't even notice that you're abroad except for what you see out the window. And I was like, that's awful. Right. And people are probably paying $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 for this type of experience. That is absolutely not the way that you should go see the world. You should go see the world and experience it. Granted, you're an American. You maybe, you need certain amenities. I get that. But get out of your comfort zone. Yeah. Be with the people. Don't let some tour guide take you into like sort of this sort of bubble, and then you're kind of just rolling through these different continents and these different cultures. Be part of that. Try the food. Yes, you may be sick for 24 hours, but you know what? That's part of the experience too. Yeah.
If I can, last year, our network is called IPREX, which we all know, and it's a collection of global firms like us. And I got to go to our meeting in India, in New Delhi, and I was traveling by myself. And as a female, I was a little bit uncomfortable with that for sure. The first 24 hours, it was one of the most incredible experiences because I felt like my taste buds were awakened in new ways. And I felt like because I was a little bit nervous about traveling by myself that far, it made me more hyper aware of every experience I was having, and ended up being such a neat experience. So if I can just put a plug for push yourself to have those experiences, you don't know how much it will awaken you, I think is a feeling I've had many times, but that one really made me feel.
The world is becoming more and more global. And I think Americans in general, and one of the reasons I think that there's a little bit of this abreaction against immigration and these new cultures that are coming into this country is because Americans, unlike the rest of the world, have not been confronted with other cultures in mass. I mean, this is a country of immigrants, of course, but say in the last 50 to 100 years, I think most Americans, many can live their entire life, say in a place like Minnesota, and not really ever have to interact with someone whose native language is not English, or someone who grew up eating different types of foods or has different customs or even different religions and cultures. And I think that is an Achilles heel for Americans in general. I think that to the extent that our educational system, the way in which we talk about the world itself, the way in which we embrace fellow human beings, I think that needs to radically change in this country. Otherwise, we're going to be overtaken by other countries that, not overtaken per se, literally, but, in terms of the culture wars, in terms of geopolitical issues, in terms of economics, by cultures that are much more dexterous.
Yeah. Well, like, instead of fighting with each other, let's find ways to build up our country. Which
is why I'm also very worried about some of this, this nationalistic rhetoric that has popped up in this country. There's always been an element of that going back to the founding of this country. That's not new. What's new is the way in which it's disseminated. And that goes back to what we were talking about in terms of like this very sort of curated, customized, hyper-personalized way of communicating that technology is able to do at scale in a way that was never possible before. But that in itself, I think, is a very dangerous element. And it's not just in this country. There's lots of countries that have that element. We're seeing that play out in national politics across Europe, places in Latin America, Southeast Asia. But it's a very dangerous element. And I think that it's ultimately going to be an ultimate disservice. And it might be our Achilles heel as a country.
It's fascinating. Switching gears a little bit. So one thing we haven't really talked about yet is what you do at Tunheim, because that's part of the reason that you're here with us today. So talk about what you do.
Join podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. You do a lot more than that.
So I think that the way to best describe it is I connect dots. And I think that, there's a lot of really smart, hardworking people here at Tunheim that are, either managing accounts or they're coming up with the creative or they're helping clients work through crises. I'm out there actually doing something very different, which is figuring out, who has the crisis of tomorrow, who has the business challenge or the communications challenge that maybe they themselves aren't even aware of yet. For example, one of the things I talk a lot about, and we talked about this just a bit ago about video and communicating, is I'm out there talking to CEOs and COOs and CFOs about their communications capabilities. And in many cases, I'm actually the one who's sitting there saying, you guys are missing the boat. You guys are laggards. You're way behind. And I think that part of my ability to have that conversation, frankly, draws upon, obviously, that I have an organization like Tunheim behind me. But on top of that, I've been there, I've done that in terms of working at the highest levels of television or media. And I think that sort of gives me, whether it's deserved or not, some gravitas to talk about some of those issues and people listen to me.
Mm-hmm.
And without giving away too many secrets, how do you work to identify who it is you're going to go talk to? Like, are there any things in specific that you see going on with a company or something that makes you want to reach out to them?
I sort of look at the marketplace through kind of the lens that, maybe a tech investor might look at the landscape. So, if you look at a tech investor, what types of companies is he interested or she interested in investing in? And I look at it as what are the types of companies that are going through massive transformation? What are the industries that are either being moved towards obsolescence, or what are the new sectors that are growing up because of a perceived demand or a new opportunity in the marketplace? That's where I think the most interesting change happens. I think the last thing that I'm interested in general is a company that's doing quite well, that is in a solid, just undisruptible industry. Those people are basically like, well, what do I need you for? But I think that when you're going through change and industries and sectors and specifically companies that are going through change, I think those are where the opportunities lie.
Mm-hmm. So as you know, Tunheim helps organizations be understood. What does being understood mean to you? All the stuff we're talking about, what do you think? What does that mean to you?
Well, being understood is actually a shorthand version of saying, what do you want people to know about you that's important? Mm-hmm. And I think for every organization, for every individual, for every entrepreneur, for every thought leader, that's going to be a different answer. And it's important to have companies like Tunheim that can help suss that out, because sometimes people don't even know what that is until you make it very explicit to them. Someone might say, oh, we're in the business of selling windows. Well, actually, no. What you're in the business of doing is creating a friendly home environment that's conducive to living a better life. That's what you're in the business of. You happen to be producing windows, but what you're really doing is selling a type of lifestyle. You're selling opportunities to be with friends and family in a loving environment, for example.
Yeah.
And so I think that, helping these companies understand what their true business is, what are their true objectives, and who they need to reach with that message is actually the core of what Tunheim does.
What makes that hard today?
It's hard because, there's just like anyone else, there's just so much information out there. There's just so many things happening. Getting people to focus on something that's not front and center. It's not the crisis of the day, usually, unless you have a sort of existential sort of, crisis, or there's something happening that needs to be addressed immediately. It's usually something that's put on the back burner. It's like nice to have.
Yeah.
It's the same type of thing I think that plagues, marketers always complain that it's hard to measure ROI. And the same thing goes with communications. How do you measure something that's, essentially intangible?
Yeah. And in everything that you do, right? Not every communication is.
The other thing I would say too is also making people understand that communications is not the same as PR. Yeah. Public relations is one thing, and that's obviously dealing vis-a-vis managing the media and your relationships with the media. But a lot of people think, when they think of communications, they think of public relations. And I tell people those two things are related, but PR is actually sort of just it's not necessarily a small component, but it's just a wing of the house, of the communications
part
house.
Of the ecosystem. Yeah.
And I think that a lot of companies and a lot of entrepreneurs, they say, my goal is to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
Yes.
Or the New York Times. And I always tell
know
them,
you hear that a lot.
or Newsweek or whatever. And I say, you know what? You don't want to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, because if you are at the stage that you're in right now, that means that you had a major crisis.
Yeah.
There's something bad happening. That's the only reason that a company comes out of nowhere and lands on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Yeah. The way it works 99 times out of 100 is there's building blocks. First, you get known in your local papers or in your trades, and then you move up to sort of third, second tier. And then after a while, you've kind of built this archipelago of different pieces that are maybe going to attract the interest of a major writer from the New York Times or from a Business Week, a Bloomberg Business Week, or whatever happens to be your objective. Yeah. The other thing too also is you want to make sure that you're ready for prime time. So often companies they're still writing their business plan, and they're already wanting to talk about that to the world, and there's no proof points there. And savvy journalists, savvy tech journalists, savvy finance journalists, they will poke holes into that right away. And that's the worst thing possible. I'll tell you a story. A good friend of mine, there's a woman, and she's the editor-in-chief. I don't think she would mind me saying her by name. Her name is Arundhati Parmar, and she's the editor-in-chief of Med City News. And she did me the biggest favor ever. And she didn't, not personally, had no idea that I was going to see this, but someone sent her, I won't name the company, some company sent her a press release, and the company was celebrating its 1-year anniversary after raising a record, $500 million Series C investment round. And that press release was about celebrating 1-year anniversary. Of course, that's not news. Yeah. Who did you hire? What did you do with that $500 million? How did you invest? Did you do any M&A? Did you do any R&D? What did you do with that that would be news. But they were just saying, we're celebrating 1 year since we raised a record $500 million. And and 99 journalists out of 100 are going to say, okay, that's not news, trash. What she did was such a great thing. She put it on LinkedIn and she said, this is a company that has no news to report, and this is a disgrace. And wow. She basically showed that the whole idea of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks is a bad PR strategy. And so every time I have a chance to talk to someone about, let's just put out a press release, see what happens. I'm like, look at this example. Yeah. Look at my friend Arundhati.
Mm-hmm. I remember that because you shared that, and remember thinking that is helpful to show this is how that's perceived on the other end, because oftentimes we are asked by clients, please help us make this into news. And some things can be made into news and other things can't. And it can be helpful to have a window into how is that received on the other end. You have also been willing to share that you get lots of pitches as well. Mm-hmm. And again, in the world of not every pitch is really strong. Do you have any tips for companies out there who are trying to think about how they position something to media about what not to do?
So I can tie this very closely, I think, to this narrative or this thesis that we're developing here in this conversation about being understood.
Yes.
And that is, if you are a company and you're trying to get the attention of a journalist, think about what is that journalist interested in writing about? You have some random, I have this person, and I won't say his name. In fact, I don't even know his name, but he pings me literally every day that he does drone advertising in the sky. And I'm thinking, what is it about me that makes him think that I care about drone advertising in the sky? I haven't really written about drones. I don't really write about advertising. I don't write about aviation. What is it? What does he think that's, and so the question is, what do journalists want to talk about? And so you have to fit whatever it is that you're doing into their narrative. That's the most that's the most effective thing you can do. The other thing you can do is almost, and I don't mean to say this lightly, but you almost want to write the article for them. And I don't mean they're obviously going to put their own primatur on it. They're going to change stuff. They're going to, do their editing. But to the extent you can make their job easier, that's really key, because newsrooms, as you guys know, have been shrunk. TV newsrooms, print newsrooms. I know people in New York that are, having to write, between 8 and 10, 200 to 400 word articles per day.
It's a lot.
And if someone has to write, 400 times 8, that's 3,200 words, but also 8 ideas, 8 very different ideas, and then make sure they're edited and da-da-da-da-da. If you're under that type of pressure, you don't have time to be like strategic and thinking, let's go have coffee. And how many times is someone is hitting me up saying, let's go have coffee? I don't have time to have coffee.
Right.
Tell me what's your idea. Give me your pitch. And if I like it, then you're going to send me something more extensive. And so I think that a lot of times companies don't understand that. They think that these journalists, it's like the Mad Men era. That was advertising, but they're having like 3 martini lunches and they got plenty of time and they're working on one story a month. That's not the way it works anymore. Newsrooms are completely different. So you need to get into that sort of mode of operating if you want to attract the attention of a journalist, and then also personalize it. So, I know you wrote about X, last week. Would you be interested in following up on, XY, which is a little bit different, but sort of similar and related? And maybe the person's like, no, I wrote on there, I'm not going to write on something else. Okay, well, what are you writing on now? What types of stories are you looking for? I love it when someone says, hey, how can I help you? And a PR person will come up to me and they'll say, I have 15 clients. What are you working on? Maybe one of them can fit into what you're doing. And I'm like, oh, I'm actually doing a story on this. Oh, I have this client with it. They kind of put the pieces together. And that's something that I think that a really good PR person does, and a really good communicator behind that PR person would figure out, okay, I know that journalist is going to write about this. How do I, make that linkage between the media opportunity and the core messaging of that client that meets that client's sort of underlying business needs?
Yeah.
When it comes to people reaching out to you too, do people reach out to you through social media, email, call you? What's the way people reach out to you the most?
Yes.
All the above.
Yeah.
I've even had people come to my door.
Yeah.
They knock on my door. I've had that twice now.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, not knock on my door, but they'll put a letter, in my door, and they'll be like, hey, and I mean, it's weird. It's very strange. Now, if I was in New York, it might be, there might be more of it, or there actually might be less of it, just because in New York, because you got buildings, it's a little bit harder. But even here, living in the western suburbs of the Twin Cities, people are coming to my house looking to get media coverage. And I get letters a lot of times. Sometimes I get them at my parents' house because they found some old address that's my parents' address where I grew up. It's really weird how people reach out.
It's kind of creepy, actually.
Yeah. No, it's
in a social digital age. But
yeah, I know when I was still in news, if somebody reached out over social media, I would tell them to email me the information just so it didn't get lost in the mix of all the different ways of reaching out to journalists.
Now, I do think there's some really great tools out there. I know that Tunheim uses very effectively tools like Quoted, which I think is actually a marketplace for ideas for stories. I think it's a really interesting tool. And I think that, there's technology is also enabling new platforms of curated communication that's, creating that marketplace between people with ideas and stories to tell and those that do the storytelling.
Yeah. But I think we can take away from this that message that, media have a job to do, just like you on the other side, just like you trying to get your story told. So help them do their job. Understand if your idea doesn't work today, not to keep pushing the same idea. Don't keep sending the drone advertising video.
I mean, but again, and why does that happen? I think the reason that a lot of these worst practices of communications and PR happen is either happens. I can't tell you how many companies I've seen this. there's someone that has a sort of marketing function, and suddenly they become the communications or PR person. And a marketer is a skill set. It's a very important skill set, and it's a very defined skill set. There are some adjacencies with communication, but it's not the same thing. And that's why it's important to have companies like Tunheim sort of working alongside. If maybe you don't want to hire a communications person, but if you may have the marketing person managing the communications firm. But that's why you need to have specialists that understand the crafts of this trade, the best practices that bring to bear sort of all of the different tools at a company's disposal for making sure that they're able to communicate in the most effective way possible.
Yep. And connect with those audiences. So what are you most excited about? We've talked about technology, we've talked about media, we've talked about these future focused things. If you could wrap all of those things together, what you see on the horizon, what are you most excited about that's coming?
I love change. I think change is exciting. I know some people hate change. Some people like it the way it is. Some people like the way they like it the way it used to be, or the way they think it used to be, even if it wasn't that way ever.
Yeah.
I think change is exciting. I think the present is fun, but I also think what's about to come is even rife with more possibilities and more potential. And so anytime there's an industry or there's a change happening wholesale in a culture like I think we're going through right now in this country, both politically in terms of technology, socially, in terms of how our makeup ethnically as a country, and some of the biggest challenges we have in front of us. Certainly, they're scary. Certainly, climate change is scary. But it's also an exciting time. How are we going to come together as a human race and solve some of these existential issues? That's exciting because you know what? Solving issues is going to lead to new breakthroughs and new technologies, and I think that it's an exciting time to be alive. I mean, that sounds a little bit trite when I say it, but I mean, I would rather live in no moment other than the present.
And lean into those challenges. It sounds like, as opposed to hope that somebody else figures them out.
Yeah.
Okay, before we go, what is one really interesting thing about you that you have not told us yet so far that people might not know?
Well, how about this? This is, some people know this, but maybe you don't, and maybe people watching this podcast don't know. But when I was doing my master's degree in Brazil, I was a very well-compensated and pretty well-known fashion model. And
what? Really?
I was, yes.
I've not heard this.
I was in Vogue. I was in Elle. I was in, did commercials for Gatorade, for Colgate, for Chevy cars, traveled all around Latin America. They wanted me to go live in Japan for a while. I decided not to do that and became an investment banker. And therefore, but even to this day, people in Brazil see me, people that know me from back then, and they still make fun of me about, these silly commercials I used to do back in the 90s.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I did not know that. There we go.
Maybe he'll pull one out for you so you can see.
I was even one month. I'll tell you a funny story. So I was doing my master's degree in economics, and I was at this university called Unicamp, which is considered to be one of the premier universities in Latin America. Very serious. President Dilma, former president of Brazil, was in the class right after me. And these are very serious people. And I had just come out in this magazine called Capricho, which is basically the Brazilian equivalent of Tiger Beat. Remember Tiger Beat?
Oh, yeah.
And I was the hunk of the month. They call it in Portuguese. They call it
we're the right demographic for Tiger Beat. Yes.
And
the hunk of the month.
Well, yeah. In Brazil, it's called colírio. Colírio is the word for eye drops. And so you're just like, the guy is so good looking, you need eye drops because it makes your eyes,
oh my gosh,
get red or whatever. And so anyway, I was the colírio, and there was a picture of me, and then a little thing that I was as an American, I was a student at the Unicamp, but I studied economics, and I had this little stupid quote, something about like, I like these two diverse parts of my life, the serious part at Unicamp and the fun part of being a fashion model in Sao Paulo. Anyway, the people in my class, they took this picture, photocopied it, and they plastered the entire classroom, this large classroom, wall to wall, with pictures of me as Colírio. And then the teachers walk in and they're like, "What the hell is this?"
Oh my gosh!
Do you still have a copy of that?
I think my mom in her basement has copies of all that stuff. Yeah.
I love it. You'll have to show us sometime.
Were you embarrassed, or were you like, "Yep, that's me"?
No, I just owned it,
Yeah.
like, what are you going to do at that point? Right. I mean, because they were doing it, not out of spite, but just, they thought I was a pretty good guy. They thought I was there weren't a lot of Americans at that university. There were just a couple of us. And so certainly I was a little bit of a fixture on campus already, but I think, they also thought it was just cool. This guy is like, has inroads into this life that I can only imagine. I met people like that, later on. I met Gisele Bündchen when she was 14 years old. I mean, I remember doing I'll tell you, my first magazine shoot when I was at Curating, the cover of that magazine was Gisele Bündchen's first cover.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a collector's item on eBay, not because me, but because of Gisele Bündchen being on the cover.
Which and maybe it's both,
Yeah.
But that is something though that I really appreciate about working with you and have come to know is that you do own the collection of your experience and you lean into that. And it's something that makes you a great advisor and colleague. So it's fun.
It's funny when I lived in Africa, my nickname was Sia. And Sia is the way they say CIA, because the people there, they all thought you must be from the CIA. There's just no way you're just like down here, like doing business and working at a TV station just because of all these odd collection of experiences that I have.
We appreciate that about you. And thank you for sharing your experiences.
Well, thanks for having me on this podcast.
Thank you.